My name is Diego Kaenzig. I'm an economics PhD student at London Business School. My research interests are in macroeconomics with a particular focus on energy, climate change, and inequality. Today I'm going to talk about a project of mine titled The Economic Consequences of Putting a Price on Carbon. The looming climate crisis is probably the single greatest challenge of our time, and we can read about it almost every day in the newspapers, for instance, when we learn about extreme weather events around the globe, which have become much more frequent because of global warming. On the current path of emissions, global average temperatures are set to increase by over 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century compared to pre-industrial levels. This will likely have devastating effects on the environment, human health and livelihoods, and the global economy. As economists, we know relatively well what we can do to address this problem in theory. Going back to Pigou, this is a clear externality, so we have to internalize the costs of polluting by putting a price on emissions at the level of the social costs of carbon. However, this has proved to be very difficult to implement in a global world with many stakeholders. More progress has been made at the national level, but still very little is known about the effects of carbon pricing on emissions and the economy in practice. In this paper, I provide new evidence on this matter from the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which is the largest and also the oldest major carbon market in the world. I will exploit institutional features of this market in combination with high-frequency data to estimate the dynamic causal effects of carbon pricing. The European Emissions Trading Scheme is a cap-and-trade system. So an overall cap is set on emissions, and within this cap, allowances are allocated and then traded. So there is a market price for carbon, and there exists also a very liquid futures market. Establishing the European Emissions Trading System was a learning by doing process, and the regulations in the market have changed considerably over time. This provides a very nice setting for identification. The idea is to isolate some exogenous variation in the carbon price by measuring the price change in a tight window around regulatory policy events concerning the supply of emission allowances. In the next step, we can use this as an external instrument to estimate the dynamic causal effects of a structural carbon policy shock. In these figures, you can see the impulse responses to a shock tightening the carbon pricing regime normalized to increase the energy price by 1% on impact. We can immediately see that carbon pricing has significant effects both on emissions and the economy. A shock tightening the carbon pricing regime leads to a significant increase in energy prices and a persistent fall in emission. So carbon pricing appears to be successful in achieving its goal of reducing emissions. However, this does not come without cost. Consumer prices increase significantly and economic activity falls, as can be seen from the responses of industrial production and the unemployment rate. This is also confirmed by looking at other macroeconomic aggregates such as real GDP, consumption, and investment. Importantly, these costs are not borne equally across society. In this chart, you can see the responses of household expenditure and income for 3 different groups of households: low income, middle income, and high income. We can see that low-income households experience a significant and persistent fall in their expenditures. In contrast, the expenditure response of high-income households is barely significant. Not only are low-income households more exposed to carbon pricing because they spend a larger share of their expenditures on energy, they also experience a more significant drop in their incomes. This is related to the fact that they tend to work in sectors that are more exposed to carbon pricing, and they don't have any financial income that can offset the negative effects on their earnings. My findings have important implications for both monetary and fiscal policy. My results suggest that targeted fiscal policy can reduce the economic costs of carbon pricing without compromising emission reductions to the extent that energy demand is inelastic, which turns out to be particularly the case for low-income households. We have also seen that carbon pricing is essentially a shock to relative prices, and this could cause a durable divergence between headline and core inflation. This in turn has important implications for the conduct of monetary policy and the mandate of price stability. This is it from my side. Thank you so much for your attention. And I would also like to thank the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance for having me.